So, good afternoon, everybody. I extend a very warm welcome to the presenter, the discussants, and all the participants to yet another edition of ISID Research Seminar Series. So, as always, the template for today is that we have a lead presentation, which is by Dr. Rohit Azad, which would be followed by three discussants sharing their views on the presentation, on the issue, and leaving some space for open house discussion for the participants. So without further ado, I would like to get into the program with few words of introduction for Dr. Rohit Azad. We have today with us Dr. Azad, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, from where he also earned his PhD degree. Dr. Azad has specialization in macroeconomic theory and policy, monetary economics, and growth theories. And these are essentially the papers that he has been teaching over the years as well. In addition to Dr. Azad's teaching, research, and publication credentials, he also has been the recipient of some important academic fellowships, such as the Fulbright Nehru Professional and Academic Excellence Fellowship for the year 1617, among others. I invite you to make your presentation on the Indian Green Deal.
Thanks, Dr. Tandon, for giving me this opportunity, and also, of course, to ISID for asking me to make this presentation. This is basically a joint paper which recently got published in Ecological Economics. So I'll be making a presentation, and I'm told that I have about 25 to 30 minutes, right?
Yes, I think 35 to 40 minutes should be fine, or even less if you wish to.
Oh, no, 35. Teachers, if you give time to, then they can go on. So, as you know, so it's better. Yeah, no, I'll wind up in 35 minutes for sure.
All right, that'll be great.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks. So I'll just share my presentation. So can you guys see my screen? I mean, the presentation?
Yes, Dr. Azad.
Okay, perfect. So I'll start. Basically, this is a joint paper, as I said, written by me and my co-author, who is at Perry, Shobhit Chakravarti. So it's a joint paper which we've been working on, but recently got published. Karthik in particular, I'd like to apologize because he has seen this and he has perhaps heard it also, at least some version of it. So yeah, so there are, I mean, just to give a background to what we were trying to do, and this is an interesting chart, not chart, a painting actually made by somebody who was during COVID trying to show that COVID is perhaps just one of the problems that we are dealing with. Essentially, there are crises at three different levels. And, you can read, be sure to wash your hands and all will be well, is what was being said during COVID-19, whereas what was coming after that and did hit the global economy was inflation and recession. At that point, there was no discussion of inflation. This is an old painting. And the biggest of it all, which you don't really see, I mean, because it's a long-term phenomenon, is climate change. And our argument is that every crisis actually provides you also with an opportunity to break free from what you've been following, from the usual headed path. And since you are anyway going to make changes in terms of investment that you would be making, in terms of fiscal policy, this may be the time to actually rethink the model of development itself. And that is the attempt that we made in this paper, that if you were to do it, then what would it look like? So the presentation is divided in three parts. First, I would present why do we need it, followed by what does the Indian Green Deal that we're proposing entails. And last but not the least, in fact, the most important, as anybody would say that, okay, fine, your fancy ideas, but where is the money going to come from? And hence financing the deal. So these are broadly the three sections in which I'm going to make the presentation. Starting with the why of it. And, this is a chart which I hope is visible. So basically what we've done here is to show the level of emissions, in terms of gigatons, the level of carbon emissions that or the carbon space that we have. So this whole bar that you see here is essentially, just one second, sorry. This that you see here essentially is the carbon space left if we were to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And the same thing equivalent is the one that you see for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the dark blue part, which is this, obviously same for both, is what we've already emitted starting with the Industrial Revolution. So we've already hit the 1.1 degree Celsius limit, as in the temperatures have gone up by 1.1 degrees Celsius, and 1.5 doesn't seem to be a target which looks achievable. But even the 2 degrees Celsius doesn't seem, it seems extremely difficult. And the reason for that extra difficulty is the following. I hope the sound is not coming from my computer, or it perhaps is.
For us, it's quite clear. We can hear you well.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So if you look at the second chart here on the right, that essentially what we've done is, if you plot the total emissions that we have made so far, so the dark blue part that you have here, and split it in two halves, and split it in a way that basically you split it from the beginning of 1800 to 1992, half of this emission had taken place, and the other half has taken place in the last 3 decades alone. So what we emitted in almost 2 centuries, we have emitted in 3 decades alone. And that just tells us the limited time that we have if we want to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And in that, I think we need to not just have a green deal for the advanced capitalist countries, but also for the global south, but done in a different way and financed in a different way, where the burden does not fall on the population of the global south. Why is it additionally important? One is obviously the problem of emissions per se, but in this particular case, the climate injustice shows up even more starkly because those who have contributed the least to the problem actually bear the brunt of it. And this is at the global scale. This is a paper by Jason Hickel. And what they do is quite simple. In the upper, this part that you see here is essentially a heat map which shows that what part of the global region, which region in the world has essentially overshot their emissions. So by overshot, one means that if total carbon space is X, you divide it per capita across the board, and then you measure the actual emissions against what would have been your fair share. And all those who have crossed their fair share are essentially countries which have overshot their emission, let's say, budget. And as you can see, it's the global north, those which are closer to the red and dark red colors are the ones which have overshot their emissions, and all those in green are still below what would be their fair share. But if you look at the lower chart, which is essentially the vulnerability, multidimensional climate vulnerability, it's a mirror image of that in terms of what we would be facing for the tropical countries and for the global south, they've created an index looking at multiple things, including agriculture and all of that, and heat, waves, etc., etc. So they've put it all together in terms of an index, and as you can see, it's a mirror image of the upper heat map, which essentially effectively very clearly shows that those who contribute the least, which is the global south, will actually be bearing the brunt of it because of the emissions that have taken place from the global north primarily. So there are two components to it. One is the fact that there is climate crisis that is taking place, and there is an inbuilt climate injustice component to it, which is true globally, which is true domestically, nationally, at a local level within Delhi. All those who pollute are not necessarily the ones who face pollution to the same extent, at least. So it is at every level you find that that hierarchy in terms of the effects of climate change. So what do we do? How can we address this? And our paper essentially argues that, I'm sure everybody knows there was a promise of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package when we were dealing with the COVID crisis, and the announcement by the Prime Minister was that we would be spending 10% of our GDP in recovering, and which they call the Atmanirbhar package, is what we would be spending on to recover the economy. What we've done is we've fixed that number, and we've said that, let's say, this is not what was spent, of course, as you know, only 2% of the GDP. So only 2% of that 2 percentage points of that 10 percentage points was actually spent. But if you were to spend that 10% of GDP over a period of 10-year horizon, and it's a lot of money, I know. So I'll come to the third part where we'll discuss where I'll present how we finance it. You can split it in three different parts. One is infrastructural change, fundamental overhaul of the infrastructure of the economy, where you spend about half of this Atmanirbhar package, which is essentially 5% of the GDP, which deals with, let's say, the economic slowdown part of the crisis that we have. Second, which is care economy, which deals with the second crisis, which is SH.
Not audible.
Rohit, can you pause? I think there's something wrong in the sound. We are not able to hear. Yes.
Oh, just one second. 1 minute. I think my phone was on. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly. Yeah. Please go on.
Yeah. And there's a third part
Can I request
Rohit, second part was where we lost your voice. After infrastructure. Right.
So the second part is essentially to deal with, as I said, there were three crises. So one is the economic crisis, which is in terms of slowdown, or in certain countries it was in terms of recession. But in this particular case, it is just 1 second. There's something on the chat. Okay, all right. And one part on the COVID crisis, where the care economy, so expenditure on health and education, in public provisioning instead of insurance-based systems, is what we propose as one component of this Green Deal. And third, being the green energy itself. I mean, the energy transition of the economy, a fundamental transition of the energy system of the economy. And that's split as 5%, 3%, and 2% of the 10% of that the Prime Minister had promised. So the first question that arises is that from how does this IGD propose to reduce carbon emissions? And going into the future, India is going to be one of the prominent countries in terms of emissions. So this deal that we are talking about, how is it going to address that? Primarily, and this is everybody knows in literature that there are three ways in which carbon intensity can be brought down. One is in the immediate, you move away from high carbon emitting fossil fuels towards low carbon emitting fossil fuels. So for example, in Delhi, the move from diesel to CNG, etc., or LPG is something which would be such a step. The other is increasing the efficiency of energy uses, which, as you know, is quite low in India. So in terms of retrofitting buildings and in many other ways that efficiency of energy usage can be improved, which for the same amount of fossil fuel burn would actually be giving us more energy, which in other words is for the same level of energy that we require, we'll be burning much less of fossil fuels. And third, which is the most important, is to actually increase investment in greener forms of energy, but that's a more long-term, slightly medium to long-term transition, strategy. You can't immediately switch to green just like that. So broadly, these three supply side measures that you have, and if you were to do this, then our projections in terms of how the carbon emissions in three different parts, energy consumption, clean renewable energy, how much would it supply? So the energy consumption A part is essentially by combining of move from high carbon emitting fossil fuel to low and increasing energy efficiency, and clean renewable energy supply, which is part B in this chart here, the one that you see here, is essentially in terms of what the green side would be contributing to. If you combine this, then that gives us a difference in terms of emissions per capita, where if you were to follow the current policy framework, and this is the number which has come from IEA for India, the emissions, let's say in 2030, would be about 2.1 metric tons per capita. And if you were to implement this policy, it will go down by at least 1/3. So from 2.1, it will come to 1.4. And in gigatons, as you can see, from 3.1 to 2. So 1/3 fall that would take place as a result of this policy. But you don't only need supply side measures, you also need demand side measures, because at the end of the day, emissions are taking place because of demand of such commodities. And in the literature, one of the ways in which, or the only way from the demand side as it can be done, is either if you cap the emissions or you put a price to it. So, in economics, you have either you ration the prices and the quantity is determined by the market, or you ration the quantity and price is determined by the market. So in this case, we are proposing carbon tax, which means that you put a price to carbon, and the amount would be determined by the market itself. Now, carbon tax system, unfortunately, is quite regressive in nature, because the tax burden of an indirect tax, as you know, is much higher on the poor because they have higher consumption propensities. So as a proportion of their income, the taxes that they would be paying would be much higher. For the same commodity, they pay the same tax. They are poorer, so they'll be paying higher tax. So obviously, we are not recommending that at all. And what is required instead is that you take this carbon tax, but then you redistribute it in terms of carbon dividends, which I'll come to towards the end of my presentation. So if you were to compensate to the poor in terms of this carbon dividend, then on the whole, you would actually find the climate injustice itself being inverted in favor of the poor. A much more important thing would be to look at not this whole thing, not at a domestic level, not at a national level, but a global sharing of responsibilities, which, if you remember from the heat map that I had shown earlier, it's obvious that a higher share of this burden should actually come on the global north. It is they who should actually be paying for this transition. Just 1 second, sorry. Sorry about that. There's a friend in the hospital. If you were to, as I said, that there needs to be a global sharing of responsibilities and not merely a domestic level policy of this kind. So there needs to be an international carbon tax system, which I'll come to in a bit. What does it do to employment? And our work based on the NSS, in this case, actually PLFS, the 17-18 round, tells us that if you were to spend this kind of money, it is going to actually generate a lot of jobs, because the job intensity or the employment elasticity, as the economists call it, is much higher for green energy. And this, this kind of donut essentially gives you how much jobs would be created in these three sectors. So we've basically taken these three sectors, the industries within these three sectors, and we've injected numbers into them. And that basically, from the input-output matrix, you get direct, indirect employment. So the details one can discuss if you're interested. And that throws up the number in terms of rupee spent. In this case, the amount that is being spent on infrastructure, generating about 17.5 million jobs in infra, 13.2 in care economy, and in green energy, 8 million jobs. So about 8.2% of the labor force, if you were to do this. Now, in terms of composition of jobs, if you were to, and we just look at, let's say, the green energy part here, if you were to compare it with respect to fossil fuels, then you would see that there is almost 2.5 times higher job intensity in green energy as compared to fossil fuels. So this is jobs created per 1 million investment if you were to make. In fossil fuels, you'll create around 80 jobs, but in green energy, you'll create around 200. So there is a dramatic difference in terms of how much jobs would be created. And one of the reasons is that fossil fuel industry is much more mechanized, and green energy systems would, of the kind at least that we are proposing, would be more employment intensive. In regional variation, in gender terms, it would, compared to the fossil fuels, it would be much better. So rural versus urban, as you can see in green, is much better as a ratio. Female, between the two systems, the green energy generates more jobs for women. Third part of section of the presentation is on how we do it and financing of the Indian Green Deal. And this is the most controversial part, because, having came and all these nice figures and all of that showing all that, whereas the number is 10% of India's GDP. Now that is a huge number. By the way, when I said 10%, that is a number which we picked from the Atmanirbhar package. It does not mean that you actually need to spend 10%. If you spend 5% of that, obviously everything else, all the employment numbers would go down by half, so on and so forth. So, it can be scaled up, it can be scaled down, but we do need to do something of this sort. How do we finance it? And we think that we can look at financing at two different levels. One, which is ideal and should be done, is at a global level. And what we did to achieve that was to do a simple exercise. This is another paper, not in this paper, but what we did was a simple exercise where we took this is in terms of flows, but what we did was we took all the countries' in the world, and we check what their current emissions are, per capita emissions are. And if the per capita emissions are higher than the global average, then they basically become the pair countries or overshoot countries, so to speak, because they are more than the global average. And they pay the countries which are actually emitting below average. Now, you can say that flow is not necessary, I mean, not perhaps the correct measurement, given the fact that stocks of emissions from these countries have been much larger from the global north. So, for example, in this case, as you can see, China happens to be a pair country, which is quite unfair. But this is an exercise which we did for the flow data. A similar exercise actually HICL has done recently in a paper with stock data as well, where China also becomes a beneficiary. So one could think of that in terms of climate reparation that the global north would have to pay. Be that as it may, India happens to be both in terms of stocks and flow actually below the average, global average, in which case India would be a beneficiary, including the global south in Africa and in Latin America. As you can see, the blue colored ones are all countries which would actually be beneficiaries because they are low emitters. So you create or you create a system where we call it the International Carbon Fund, not on the lines of the IMF, but a progressive body which forces the global north to pay for their sins of the past. That way, the amounts that would be generated actually, for some strange reason, and this is an old paper, it matches exactly the amount that we need for the Atmanirbhar package. So anyway, that is just happenstance. We didn't rig the result. The IGD requires 262, and this happened to be 268. And I can come to the exact methodology how we did it. It's there in the last slide. But you could say that this is, an ideal world. It's not going to happen. Not paying despite all the efforts in different COPs. So you may say that this is how it should be. This is how fair it should be. But then the point is, if it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. So what do we do? And our argument would then be that you fall back on the second option, where if the global elites are not paying, the Indian elite pays for this transition. In which case, you can do it through different forms of tax, which actually are either quite low or don't exist. So, for example, inheritance tax we don't actually have in India. Property flows from Dhirubhai Ambani to Anil Ambani and Mukesh Ambani without them paying any inheritance tax at all. At one point, there was a marginal inheritance tax, but not anymore. There are other forms of taxes. There is short-term and long-term capital gains tax, but there are other taxes which need to be could be implemented to finance this deal. And one which is quite important, and that is the corporate tax itself. Instead of giving tax breaks, you actually need to have corporate taxes, particularly from companies which are high carbon emitting companies. And the third component is carbon tax, which I had mentioned earlier, where you finance a part of this, which is basically the green energy component of this Indian Green Deal, is financed entirely by carbon tax. So that is scenario one within domestic financing situation, where it's a balanced budget. So it's entirely financed by taxes. But then there is another possibility where part of it is deficit finance. So 50% tax, 50% deficit. So the entire thing just goes down by half in terms of taxes. So broadly, these are all hypothetical numbers, so to speak, except the carbon tax, which is exactly matching the amount that is required for the green energy transition. So that, but rest is just a ballpark figure of where this thing can come from. The problem, as I had mentioned in the beginning, is that carbon tax, while it is good in terms of controlling demand, it's extremely regressive in nature. And the reason why it is regressive is exactly for reasons where indirect taxes, it's an indirect tax. So if you and a poor person buys a Parle-G biscuit, both of them actually pay the same price. And a poor person essentially would be paying a much higher share of her income if they buy that Parle-G biscuit. So any such tax which percolates down into commodity tax is going to be regressive in nature. And this chart essentially shows you that. So the left part here is essentially the carbon footprint in terms of metric tons per capita. And this is for the different, this is from the NSS. So this is the poorest 10% of the population, and this is the richest 10% of the population. Actually, this is not the richest 10% because NSS obviously does not, let's say, survey the richest section of the Indian population. But given the limitation of data, this is what we have. And it shows that obviously, even with this limited survey of the richest, you find that the richest almost emit 9 times as high as the poorest 10% of the population. But when you put a carbon tax to control these emissions, the effect is opposite. The poor actually end up paying 15% of their household expenditure as carbon charge, and the rich only pay 11%. So this is very, very unfair. On the one hand, you are not contributing, you're facing the brunt of it, and you also end up paying more. So obviously, it does not make sense in addressing injustice at all, even though it may address the climate crisis. So what can be done to address that? We basically propose a solution to this in terms of a carbon dividend. So you collect the carbon tax, but a part of this carbon tax you use to provide dividends to people. It could be in the form of carbon income, carbon tax, or whatever you want to call it, a universal basic income, or it could be in the form of sign, which could be in terms of ration, it could be in terms of free electricity, it could be in terms of public transport. So, for example, the Delhi policy of free public transport for women or 200 units of electricity are the kind of progressive, carbon dividends that one could think of. The difference here is there was no tax imposed by the Delhi government; it only gave dividends, and hence everybody, I mean, even the rich are essentially enjoying the benefits which they should not have been. Let's say in electricity in particular. If you were to do that, the calculation is we've put certain numbers in terms of how much public transport, free public transport would you provide, and how much of, in this particular case, it was energy that would be provided to every household. And it shows that the dividends far outweigh the carbon charge that the poorest would be paying. And the opposite happens for the richest 10% of the population. And because you have basically everybody gets the same. So in terms of the amount of money that I have, the poorest person gets a much higher share. If everybody is getting universal dividend per capita terms dividend, then obviously the richest would be getting the lowest in terms of compensation that they would be getting per unit of their income. So dividends are the same, but in terms of percentage of expenditure is why the number that you see here is very low and so high here. And in this chart, we have basically just subtracted the dividends, the carbon charge from the dividends. So you get the net dividends from this Indian Green Deal. And as you can see, it inverts the inequality or the carbon injustice pyramid, which we had started with, that the poor are at the receiving end of it. Here, the poor gain from this policy. About 23% of their total expenditure they get as net benefit from this policy. And the richest, or the top 30% of the population, pay for the bottom 70% of the population's improvement in standard of living. In this process, every household in India will have access to electricity, because the green energy program is changing the energy mix from the supply side, and the carbon tax and dividend policy is helping it from the demand side. Then households, including the rich, because the prices would go up of carbon intensive commodities, would look for greener substitutes to move away from SUVs and very high energy consuming commodities towards greener substitutes, and also entice the poor to move away from traditional forms of energy consumption, because the price of energy for them is zero, whereas there is some shadow positive price in terms of health setbacks, in terms of the time that they would be spending in collecting wood and cow dung cakes, so on and so forth. So here you get clean energy with zero price for you. So both for the rich and the poor, there is reason to make transition. And dividend of this kind addresses the adverse health impact of outdoor air pollution as well. So this is it from my side. These are the details in terms of how we arrived at the numbers, just to show that we have really done work, and we're not just claiming these numbers to be numbers coming out of nowhere. This is the input-output codes. Those are the NIC codes with which we have matched. And this is how we calculated the global. All these sigmas and hats give some impression you have done some work. So thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rohit, for sticking to the time and for the wonderful presentation. Your presentation has essentially highlighted the potential of investing in infrastructure, care activities, and green energy transition in terms of not only greater and more green jobs vis-a-vis brown jobs, but also in terms of this investment, if tweaked around in specific through carbon taxation and carbon dividends, can turn around the skewed pattern of inequated impact on the poor vis-a-vis the richer ones. We'll have, I'm sure this is initiated a lot of interest in the audience, and there'll be quite a few questions for you. I'll quickly now move on to our discussion session. I would first invite our discussants in the order of their names in the program. So I first call upon Dr. Nityananda. A few words of introduction for Professor Nanda before I give the floor to him. Dr. Nityananda is an economist and a public policy analyst with more than 2 decades of experience in research, consulting, and teaching. He works in the area of political economy. Presently, Dr. Nanda is the director of Council for Social Development in New Delhi. Prior to this, he has worked at National Council of Applied Economic Research, CUTS International, and the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. Dr. Nanda has also worked on many consulting assignments from several US or UN organizations and for different government ministries and agencies in India. He has also authored and edited several volumes. So with that, sir, I invite you for your discussion and comments on our speaker's presentation today. You may take about 10 to 12 minutes, if that's all right with you.
Thank you, Anjali. And it's nice to be speaking after the presentation of Rohit and in absentia Souvik. Both of them are good friends. I found it very interesting, partly because, before the Rio +20, when this green agenda was proposed by the Western world, we had to say, no, this is not acceptable to us, because there was almost nothing except green energy. So as if our health problem, as if our educational problem, as if our poverty problems all have been solved. So obviously we had to oppose it. But when I see today, not only infrastructure, but even care economy, becomes part of Green Deal, it's difficult to oppose in that sense. So that's very pleasant transition that has happened over the years. Rohit is a very clever author. So he has mentioned all his limitations of the study. So you find it difficult to say you have not done this, you have not done this, this is wrong, it's very difficult. So basically I would kind of focus on a few of the larger issues. Care, of course, as he has mentioned, COVID has shown us how we lacked in terms of healthcare. It goes without saying that, if you depend on private sector will demand, respond to only demand, not the needs. So your needs would be kind of ignored, and only demands would be served. So that was the inadequacy part of our infrastructure, health infrastructure, that we could see in COVID time. This problem with this climate action is typical, like prisoner dilemma problem. If you look at it from Indian perspective, Rohit has also assumed that this is not that we are doing, all other countries will take similar actions. But this is where the problem starts, because what is the guarantee that all other countries will have similar actions? And I'm afraid that if we get into prisoner dilemma, then everybody will be going a bit low on their actions, and situation would not be the best outcome that we all would like to see, but maybe the worst that you can see. For India, it is often a choice between mitigation and adaptation. And of course, it is not always either or scenario, as Rohit has also mentioned. Sometimes mitigation and adaptations can go hand in hand. But nevertheless, so for problem with India is that, should we go with full force on mitigation, or we prioritize adaptation more? Because if other countries do not do enough, then what will happen to us? We have to take care of ourselves about the impacts of climate change that is going to happen. There is no denying the fact that over the years, we did not see promised finance and technology coming to developing countries. And how better situation will come in future is in only to see. And there is no denying the fact that those who own green technologies are often seeing it as an opportunity, climate crisis, an opportunity to monetize that technology as much as possible. That is typical capitalist tendency that you'll find. So it is not like those who own the technologies are kind of will give them on platter, and you will find it a bit difficult to access them. Solar and coal, of course, which also Rohit talked about, in some sense, solar actually has become cheaper rather than not competitive. It's cheaper. But the problem is that solar is not yet a substitute. There's a difference between being cheaper and being substitute to coal. Now, how do we make solar as a substitute of coal? That is important. And here, the choice between solar PV and solar thermal becomes important. To my understanding, solar thermal has a better chance of becoming, substitute than solar PV, because solar PV will be based on essentially battery kind of storage, which would be necessary for night time or when you don't get solar power. But thermal has the potential with, the technology is not yet standardized, technology is not yet freely available, but this molten salt preservation technology can give you, solar power even at night without much of additional cost and without getting into making batteries, which itself is not environmentally so sound. Now, the problem again is that somehow we still believe rather mistakenly that the West can maintain its lifestyle and rest of the world can also, copy that lifestyle in future in next 10, 20 years, and yet climate change problem can be addressed. To me, that seems to be quite infeasible, and we have to think of lifestyle change also. Otherwise it becomes difficult. To give an example, like Rohit also shown in his paper that carbon tax can be regressive as well. Now, because of the very complicated economic structure you have, the white collar jobs are in sector where climate energy intensity might be low. The same thing is here. Like today we might see China is having higher emission, but the fact is that the global capital market, all are dominated by Western powers, and which give you huge amount of return without any kind of emission to be emitted. Now China, because that space, R&D space, the entertainment space, the IPR space, the finance space was all occupied by the West. The only space that was available for China was to get into industry, which is very, very energy intensive, emission intensive. Now China got into that, and the Chinese industrial goods are not being consumed by Chinese people only. They are consumed by all over the world, including the West. So Western people are to a large extent are also responsible for Chinese emission. This is something that, we see nationally, we see internationally. That cannot be ignored. So what we need therefore is to think about, again, poverty, health, education, care, fine, but also about what will happen, what will be the secondary impacts of going for climate mitigation technologies. For example, we are depending so much on lithium ion battery, lithium ion and lithium and mining of other rare earth materials. We are to some extent we are ignoring their potential environmental impacts. To give an example, what can happen with agenda-driven, technology adaptation, because there are all kinds of people who are saying this kind is better, go for this. Now, when you go for public transport, I think it's a crazy idea to go for, battery-operated bus, because if you are running buses in a designated routes, why you have to go batteries, which adds to energy loss through charging, discharging, and storage. If you can have overhead cables and have trolley buses, you can get direct electricity for the buses instead of going for the battery. So you will not make battery, you will not get those energy loss in the process. You will have a much better efficient system. But when you go as agenda driven, then you make often choices which may not be all that good. So this means that we also need to think of an integrated analysis, integrated look, where we look at not only emission, but also resource use, where resource efficiency will be an important part of our whole narrative and discourse. Now, if I talk about a few things where I think I might disagree with the authors, the elasticity being similar in future, maybe that might not be true, because if you have seen the kind of R&D that is happening over the last decade or so, green technologies are getting more money, and because of that, you are finding more technology change in green sectors compared to non-green sectors, which essentially would mean that if you have more technological change in green sector, the green sector technology will become more capital intensive. That's the nature of technological change. So this is something that you might think of. Second thing is about R&D, where Rohit expect a lot of R&D is going to happen in India, and R&D in India would give us good return. I would be a bit skeptical, because our R&D infrastructure is in very bad state. And without a basis, if you add some more money, you will not get technological returns. That is one important observation, or I would slightly beg to differ with Rohit. Next is about inheritance tax, which I think we should have introduced it in 1947 itself, but we have not done somehow. But monetizing it in the short run might be a bit difficult. Like the example he gave, that when assets went to, oil went to Anil and Mukesh Ambani from Dhirubhai, no tax was paid to government. But in such typical cases, what will happen? The taxes will come to government in terms of share of companies rather than money. And will the government be able to, sell all those shares immediately? Will that be feasible or the best possible idea? Will that destabilize the company itself in terms of its corporate governance? So those would be issues of monetizing wealth tax. Third thing is, I would say, when he says that India would be, tomorrow's India would be today's China, I think that's not going to happen because the amount of resources that China is using today, my hunch is that India will never be able to access that much of resources. Now, this can be good news, this can be bad news. Good news is that India has to go for some greener path, some resource efficient path, because those resources will not be available. But if India somehow is not able to, go to that path, then our development itself will be compromised. And then, our people, the poor people, the have-nots will remain have-nots for, foreseeable future. So with that, I will stop here. But thank you both authors, Rohit and Souvik, for writing this paper, which is, I would say, we have taken a very different approach compared to most Green Deal papers one could see. So congratulations to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nanda, for sharing with us your views on the paper and highlighting certain constraints and also giving some possible solutions, as you pointed out in the case of public transport being not as battery dependent through ropeways used for the electric operated buses. And also in terms of constraints, largely you were trying to point out that if not all countries are following a similar path and they have different preferences, as we saw in a recent summit also, that certain developing countries were opting more for a CCSU options rather than other paths to green industrialization, then there may not be as uniform concerted initiatives towards achieving these deindustrialization or decarbonization of the economies. With that, I switch to our second discussant for the day, which is Mr. Karthik Ganesan. Mr. Ganesan is a fellow and a director of the research coordination at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. Mr. Ganesan has played a pivotal role in conceptualizing and executing some of the biggest success programs at the CU. He continues to be an active researcher with the power sector and air pollution work programs at the Council. He holds a master's degree in public policy from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He also holds an undergrad degree in engineering, civil engineering, and has an MTech in infrastructure engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. I welcome you and invite you to make your comments on the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Sangeeta. Thank you so much. First off, I forgot to mention that we also share an office space. Our office is right next to yours. So a wonderful space. I'm just disappointed that we're doing this virtually and not in the verdant campus of ISID. But nevertheless, I'm glad to also see that there are lots of people joining us from all around. So thank you so much for your time. Going back to Rohit's presentation, many years ago now, probably 5-6 years ago, I think they'd written a pre-version of this, as a thought piece of what happens if you were to basically tax and then redistribute And I think the idea that caught my mind at that point was the public transport link one. Rohit, if you remember, I think there was a proposal, of how you effectively tax fossil fuel use and effectively, give it as sort of, credits for public transport use, which are effectively pro-poor. And, it's like tokens, that you would effectively monetize on a bus. And that idea stuck, and I think the theme is still the same, which is, you're taxing the rich to pay the poor. But one of the things that we've realized over time, at least working specifically in the sectors that we are in, which is, renewable energy and sustainability more broadly, is, this model of the big state coming in and intervening to make available the finances, right? Whether that is the domestic government or whether it's the international governments. It's a bit of a, it'll be a fairy tale ending if it does happen. So, the focus really is, then shifted to how do we get, the international private markets and of course the domestic private markets to buy into this narrative. One of the things, Rohit, I want to actually clarify, maybe you can respond to this at some later point, was, I see that I think investment in the Indian economy is roughly about 20, 25, 20, 30% of GDP. So this additional 10% that you're talking about, is that over and above, is the question that I really had. You can, of course, reflect on that. And more importantly, not being an economist myself, I was not sure of whether the feedback effects of basically, the taxation are factored into overall GDP, or whether it's sort of linear in that, the taxation does not effectively then preclude, private investment. And as a result, that downward spiral. So I'm guessing that's factored in, but it would be good to understand, whether that was captured in the model. A couple of, observations really on the paper. One is, I think, most recently, for instance, Rohit talked about the power sector. And I see, for instance, there is even a small anti-nuclear stance there in your paper, Rohit, where you've taken down nuclear to zero. Well, first thing I would argue is, I think all things, zero carbon should be welcome, irrespective of the, I guess, which side of the ideology you're on. So perhaps that is one change that I would probably propose, because ultimately the other thing that we must remember is we have a very narrow basket. In fact, there is not much of a basket in the 2070 electricity system at all. It's mostly solar, with wind kind of playing bit part roles, and then storage. So with that kind of lack of diversity, we're setting ourselves up for a lot of failures, a lot of challenges, bottlenecks in perhaps production. And more importantly, nobody's ever thought of what happens if there's, during the monsoons, for instance, right? Like how much storage will be required. So very far away, of course, when we have a system that has that much solar, but nevertheless, important to think of diversity. So for that reason, maybe altering the basket is important. But this thing about jobs, that's the other thing that caught my attention, where, I know you couldn't get into the details of where the jobs particularly are. Yes, we also certainly, do this annual exercise of, and I know, Rohit, you've also referenced that in your study in terms of the number of jobs per megawatt of, solar, whether it's rooftop or grid connected. What we do find is that while there is some truth to, the fact that solar does generate, whether it's utility scale or rooftop, for instance, generates even more jobs per megawatt, because again, the scale is not there. And as a result, you have slightly more labor intensive deployment, for instance. It's not playing out on the ground. And I'll tell you the reason why. For instance, recently we were looking up this example of this investment of close to 18,000 crore in a new power plant in Uttar Pradesh called Obra. Obra D is the name of the power plant. It's a phenomenal level of investment. And we were told that, it's a bit of a politically motivated investment, where the expectation is that because the thermal power plant brings in such a massive level of, infrastructure spending, right, in the cement, concrete, steel, and then the site clearance, construction, there is an incentive to basically front load the jobs that go into it. That what it does to basically kickstart the economy is so large that there is almost no incentive for somebody to think about what the long-term costs are. So I think, as with all analyses where we demonstrate that, there's, if you're looking at energy economics, right, there's this concept of the LCOE, or the total cost of ownership, TCO. Those work out nice and fine, but it's really in how are those benefits staggered, right? If you're front loading it, the benefits to the, to the hegemons are front loaded, then they will resist, right, whatever you're trying to change. And I feel that is something that doesn't get captured in these kinds of analysis. And we need to figure out how do we, portray that lag, and how do we capture, for instance, the long-term costs that these communities will have to bear, for the short-term gains that they may have by virtue of, the thousands of crores of investment that come in, right? Whether it's the pollution, whether it's the, the quality of jobs, and that is what really needs to be communicated to them. I feel otherwise, the immediate benefit that they're likely to see is clearly more when it comes to this. And again, on the jobs, there is also no consensus on the induced jobs, right? In fact, even indirect jobs. I'm sure you have factors, I know we even discussed this separately as to whether there is a more authoritative source of data for, jobs specifically in coal and thermal power. Unfortunately, there isn't. And I think, that is a body of work that needs to sort of come out from some group. We're putting some efforts, but I think it is something that will have to be, multi-institution. There, looking at the, the induced jobs is, I think, very important. I'm not sure to what extent, for instance, PLFS, etc., are able to provide insights into that. I'm presuming those are more direct jobs and not so much the induced jobs. And ultimately, it's about, which state wins, which state loses. And those dynamics are, again, papered over in a national level model, right? How do you basically affect intra-country transfers? I'm sure, that's probably another level of complication, right? Splitting this entire IO table into, multiplied by 35 to basically that get consensus in sort of intra-trade that happens. But notwithstanding all of it, I think that's the other thing that really is stalling progress today, right? If you go to any forum where you have a bunch of state actors, you find that, they are able to not agree on, what will be their share in the contribution. For instance, Orissa wants to be an RE generator. They don't want to depend on RECs to drive the transition. But the problem is the cost of generation in Orissa is higher. Cost of RE, because of, one could argue it's because the scale is not available, large enough land parcels are not available. So how do you then factor in, the economies of scale that effectively drive RE to certain pockets? More importantly, for instance, policy, right? This ISTS waiver, how that is, for instance, pushing a lot of RE into Western states. So you talked about, of course, the global inequity. I think what I think a lot of people, domestic policymakers talk about is the domestic inequity, which is, states that were hitherto, the ones that were basically making money from fossil fuel, which is, of course, the underbelly of the just transition debate, right? How are they basically benefiting from this? So talking about that a little bit more will be useful. And I also feel like, there's more clarity that's needed when it comes to this $200 billion. I understand, that these are to indicate the levels of investment. For instance, a few of my colleagues did an assessment paper when, this 2070 announcement happened from Government of India. And the investment requirements that were talked of there were, for instance, for this decade to keep to the that India 2070 net zero target, which is probably slightly more aggressive than the steps, right, was of the order of, let me just look at that figure. I think that was about 200 billion over the decade, right? Because obviously it's not front loaded. A lot of investments actually happen, and this is only in power, mobility, and in in industry, right? So 200 billion a year seems like a very large figure, and that's why I asked, for clarity as to what does it represent, right? Where are the investments happening? And the strength, though, I think of the approach that you've taken is you've gone beyond just the energy sector, right? Obviously, in the way you're covering the economy, as Nitya also said, right, you're possibly looking at those aspects of the economy that are obviously being the focus of other economies, right? When you're talking about transitioning, the system, for instance, in a country like Japan, or for that matter, even in pockets of India where aging is happening, right? How are you also factoring in that demographic change and, and the investments that are needed for those to be able to cater to, what they want? And your model, of course, is 2030, so that kind of change is not happening. But I think looking at those aspects of the transition also would be equally good. And for that reason, I think we are also looking at what does it mean for jobs in sectors that are currently, right, not there at all. For instance, let's look at, a big part of the economy, which is the recycling economy, right, or the circular economy, as it's commonly sort of called in the energy transition parlance. There is a big opportunity. It's just that sector doesn't exist, right? That sector doesn't exist because today it's mostly a sort of, use and throw it for the most parts, at least globally. In India, maybe less so, but certainly, in the case of many things, we do dispose. those offers phenomenal opportunity. For instance, sectors like rural livelihoods that are home-based, right? Home-based productive livelihoods. Those are not even sort of captured in these surveys because those are not considered possibly formal employment. Rohit, please correct me again on this. But there's opportunity there, right? There's opportunity, for instance, in new sectors, for instance, in the bioeconomy, right? If biofuels and relying on the biomass stock is going to be there, then factoring all of those new sectors, and I'm guessing this is where it's a challenge for you to operate with a legacy, IO table, which possibly does not factor in, these sectors of the economy, and you have to effectively then create, right, how these will then interact with the rest of the system. And this is the challenge with, I think, the legacy approaches, wherein you don't have these technologies and sectors in the conventional economy, at least monitored formally, but you have to actually start making them part of the formal economy. So how do you then reconcile those? Because otherwise we're setting ourselves up for the same challenges, right? I mean, as I think somebody was telling me this the other day, where let me try and recollect. Yeah, this is about, for instance, ragi cultivation, because that seemed to be sort of, more small farmer. But eventually, if it all becomes a predominantly ragi system, we're again going back to how do you improve yields on ragi, right? Because you've got to feed more people with it. So then we'll slowly, nutrient-heavy cultivation start creep into that as well. So I think for that reason, it's important to sort of bake in some of those long-term, expectations from sectors into these models, so that you are then restricting how much resource goes into it. So that's fundamentally driving the way you're thinking about the transition, right? Otherwise, we're then effectively then setting up these sectors which sort of become, whether it's capital intensive or resource intensive in the way they operate, and then we're perpetuating today's problems just in a different paradigm. That again speaks to the material dependence and all of those as well. So I think overall, I know I've probably spoken more about gaps. I'm really sorry about it. It's just that we've spoken so many times about it, but I think it's a good approach to obviously, discuss that these are the possibilities. I think the notion that this distributive economy that we need, right, whether that comes through a tax or or revenue sharing between the global north and India, or whether the rich and the poor in India, is a debate that needs to be had. And I think a lot of entities do good work in identifying this for sectors, right? For instance, on transport, how, for instance, private transport is massively subsidized in India today by way of the investments that go into roads, but not into buses, right? So all of these are implicitly there in the sectoral discussions. Bringing this out, I think, into the into the open and talking about how we visibly subsidize the consumption of the poor is, I think, a much needed debate. But I feel like making it a government sort of public expenditure thing is probably the main sort of, I think, drawback that I would see. And how do you involve the private sector and then their expectations of finance and returns? If that can be captured in this, I think this will make for a more wholesome reading and maybe convince people who are not of the same ideology as maybe many of us in this group. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ganesan, for your views. Essentially, you've highlighted that there's probably a need to factor in variations that might be occurring on account of, say, for instance, intra-country transfers, demographic changes that some pockets might be witnessing more than others, emergence of new and upcoming sectors such as circular economy, recycling of which is more prominent in certain specific sectors or industries vis-a-vis others, and the emergence of biofuels and some other new upcoming industries. And yes, it is, of course, we are also pleased to have you in our neighborhood. I hope we surely get to meet each other one-on-one in near future. With that, I turn to our third discussant who has been waiting for a while. So I'll take a while to introduce Dr. Easwaran Narasimham, who is an associate professor at the Center for Policy Research and is also a faculty affiliate at the Flusher School, Tufts University. He works on green industrialization and energy transition in emerging economies. Prior to joining CPR, Dr. Easwaran was a postdoctoral fellow in science, technology, and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Easwaran holds a PhD in international affairs from the Flusher School, Tufts University. I invite you to make your comments. A very warm welcome.
Thank you, Professor Anjali, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. And of course, I should tell Rohit, this was an amazing paper and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And I've listened to Shauvik's presentation before once, and you were also there in that conversation. This was a few months ago, back in early 2022. And I'm happy to see that the paper is published now in full form. So I have a few comments to make, and I'll restrict that primarily to the energy transition that you're speaking about in the paper, as I don't have the necessary expertise to comment on the recovery from the COVID pandemic and the opportunity that it provides for an energy transition to happen. And I believe that an energy transition that has to happen in the next coming decades will involve significant structural changes, and any crisis is an opportunity for such a transition to happen. And I see that the combination that you're trying to strike here is quite interesting. I think Karthik made a lot of comments that I wanted to make, so and that saves quite a bit of time. But I'll start with a few comments. One is a recent modeling effort at the Tufts University that I was involved, and a comparative assessment of different emissions economy models that inform Indian policymaking today that we are doing at CPR. One thing that clearly comes out of all of these models is that investments in clean energy technologies and investment in a green transition, or something like the Indian Green Deal that you propose, is definitely likely to increase GDP and job benefits more than business as usual, or at least it's not going to have net negative impact than a business as usual scenario that we have today. So that there is good amount of convergence there. So with that, I will start a discussion on jobs first. So I agree with the fact, the order of the sequence that you have, that investments in energy efficiency followed by medium-term investments in green energy technologies, which aligns with the fact that our grid is not ready for an accelerated deployment of clean energy technologies and an accelerated coal phase down to start today. And our modeling study indicates that this decade may have to be the decade of preparation in terms of preparing the grid, in terms of developing local capabilities to capture the value chain activities for the energy transition in various clean energy technologies before we start this accelerated deployment in the decades after. So there is agreement definitely over there. But in terms of the jobs that it creates, one thing that we have observed in our modeling study is that while energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit that will reduce carbon emissions and also create jobs, implementing material efficiency policies could actually lead to reduction in jobs because it would lead to reduction in the need for products to be consumed in any system that we create or build or retrofit, right? So we'll have to be a little bit more careful in making the statement that all efficiency improvements are going to actually lead to more jobs. That's a caveat that I wanted to add. And in terms of the jobs created, selecting specific clean energy technologies, I believe should not be based on the labor intensity of the technology, particularly because technologies evolve and over time, automation can lead to different labor intensities for different technologies, and we don't really know how that's going to evolve, right? So choosing the basket of clean energy technologies should be based on the need, the need in a particular country, the resource availability in that particular country, and then we see whether we can maximize the amount of jobs that we can create in the process. And the best way to do that is to capture the activities across the value chain. And as we all know, most of the value creation for renewables happen upfront. Once you produce the renewable energy components and construct and deploy, there are not many jobs left. And that goes back to the political economy that Karthik was mentioning, that in regions where coal power plants exist, it is actually feeding a huge amount of population with resource extraction that then goes into powering the coal power plants. But with renewable energy, that's not the case. So if India can't capture the job opportunities in the upfront value creation that happens in renewables, here I'm bringing in the dependence and heavy dependence on China, for example. So in your paper, you argue that instead of the North-South dependence, we can move away from that and actually have a global South-South cooperation for this energy transition. But I don't know if China can be considered South anymore. In the traditional definition of South, so if you is dependence for component imports on China desirable for an energy transition that we are going to undertake? For example, by mid-century, our modeling study indicates that we should add close to 2,000 gigawatts of renewables, right? And that's about 50 gigawatts every single year. But if you look at our manufacturing capabilities today, it's 1/5 of the requirement, annually to reach there. And we depend more than 3/4 for component imports on clean energy technologies from China. I'm not saying that we should not depend on China for imported components. In fact, if they are providing good quality at competitive prices, might as well make use of that. That makes renewable energy deployment. This fine balance that you'll have to strike in terms of what are the opportunities that you can capture, and what's the pace of deployment for renewables that you'll have to set. If you don't want to decarbonize too soon and lose out on the upfront value creation opportunities, while you also don't want to decarbonize too late, just because of the realities of climate change and the need for undergoing a low carbon development trajectory. So that's something that I want to emphasize here, how the geopolitics with China, our energy security, when it comes to a low carbon development trajectory, will play out in this respect. And the second that I wanted to talk about is on the tenure of green jobs, right? Karthik already brought this up. Green jobs, a lot of the green jobs are temporary in nature. That's an issue. The second is the spatial spread of these green jobs that are going to be created. So unfortunately, the most coal-dependent states are the least prosperous states in the country, and the renewable surplus states are the most prosperous states. And in an energy transition, you're going to see jobs, declining in states that depend on the fossil fuel sector, while jobs getting created in states that are rich with renewables and are already prosperous, right? So the spatial impact of the job creation also matters. I'm not sure how that can be factored into a model, but it's important to bring that into the discussion and see what can be done through policy to actually mitigate the spatial impact and spatial inequity that we will see in a Green Deal. The third important point that I wanted to make is the point of industrial policy. I've already brought it up with respect to China, but we are also now seeing this supposed champions of free trade implementing green industrial policies. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the CBAMs in Europe, are clearly green industrial policies, and rightfully so, to benefit and create jobs locally for their own citizens. But it sits uncomfortably, with a global Green Deal, as is mentioned in the paper. The global Green Deal does not seem to be sitting comfortably with national level green deals that are being created, whether it's Green Deal that's being created in India with an industrial policy approach, or a Green Deal that's created in Europe and the US with an industrial policy approach. In fact, unlike China, which captured the opportunities with its joining the WTO in 2001, India will now have to catch up and emerge as a green technology leader in a world where the lead markets that China had is not going to be available for India, because the lead markets themselves are trying to localize a lot of production. So what does that actually mean for us now in terms of pursuing a Green Deal? What it means is that India will have to create protected domestic market for its domestic industries if the lead markets are closed off to ramp up manufacturing and develop and build capabilities. So that puts us into a very tricky trajectory right now. And there are some solutions. WTO reform is pretty much already late. It has to happen anytime soon if the world is interested in the benefits of the energy transition being shared globally for everyone. So, and finally, coming to the carbon tax, our model shows that is in agreement with what you're saying. Carbon tax is a great way to both decarbonize and also redistribute and reduce the impact of energy taxes for the poor. But the tricky part here is that consumers already pay a very, very high share of implicit carbon taxes through fuel taxes today in India. And despite that, most consumers and firms are inelastic, primarily because of the lack of technology substitutes. So if India were to implement a carbon tax, that would be on top of the fuel taxes that are already acting as significantly high implicit carbon taxes. So that's definitely going to create some short to medium term increase in burden, both for firms whose competitiveness will be impacted. Probably not so with CBAMs coming into place. In fact, firms will now become more competitive by facing carbon taxes. But for consumers, this is going to have a significant impact. If revenues from carbon taxes are redistributed, then the government is going to face an impact, because both central government and state governments in India are heavily dependent on fuel tax revenues. For states that have a huge fossil fuel ecosystem, it's up to 20%. For the central governments, close to 12 to 13%. And a lot of this money goes into general spending and welfare spending. So as fuel tax revenues dry up in a decarbonization scenario, it has to be compensated through some form. And one form to compensate is a tax shift to a carbon tax. But if we were to redistribute this carbon tax through dividends, then you won't have this carbon tax compensating for the lack of fuel tax revenues. So where the fuel tax revenues are being spent today, those programs are going to be affected. So I'm not sure if we can use carbon tax revenues entirely as dividends. There may have to be some kind of sharing of the revenues, part of it going back to industries for them to improve and reduce their carbon footprint, part of it going to compensating fuel tax revenue losses, and part going as dividends. And on the other side, there is the argument that if consumers are not spending money on fuels and not paying fuel taxes, they have a consumer surplus. But that's the case with the section of the society that consumes fuels the most, not with the section of the society that are significantly poor. And that makes a very strong case for dividends, in fact, that you're making in this paper. So that's a tricky part that needs to be ironed out. And the final point that I want to make here is what does this mean for the federal polity, right? So fuel taxes, states have the power to tax fuel today. do states have the power to implement carbon taxes? Would a shift from a fuel tax regime to a carbon tax regime centralize, further centralize, tax resources and reduce the ability of states to raise revenues? So this is also an area that I'm quite interested in looking to the future, especially in the context of implementing an energy transition deal. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iswaran, for your observations. Essentially, two key points that you try to highlight, amongst others, are that the challenges of green transition might be costing more jobs, particularly in states which are more fossil fuel dependent compared to the states which have richer presence of renewable energy sources and utilities in them. And also, it was very nicely pointed out that industrial policy advantage which China had will probably may not be available to India, because we are now operating in a different global order where the lead markets will not be available to India, as those developed markets are now more inward looking within themselves. That ends up all discussions from all our three discussants for the day. And Rohit, you might like to respond to some things before we open it out to the larger forum of participants?
It all depends on how much time we have. The discussion has been fantastic, I must say. I mean, even though most of them were the devil's advocate here, which is good for a paper, because you get the other side of what exactly the arguments could be in terms, not other side in that sense, but what are the problems with the arguments that we are making. And I think I really appreciate that. Although I won't be able to do justice, of course, to there are many, many comments and questions. So I don't know. I mean, it depends A, on time, and B, on opening the floor. So what I could do is briefly respond, like really briefly, and then perhaps take questions. I mean, that's something that's...
Sure, I think that is perfect.
Okay. So lots of comments, and if I miss, obviously I'll miss. So I'll pick the larger questions which are there from all the three discussions, and then see if I can respond to those. The tougher questions I'm leaving out and just say that there is not enough time. But about the industrial policy, which is what Iswaran ended with, and I think that is the most important thing, which is not part of this paper, of course, but is the most important thing when we are thinking in terms of this transition. Every country currently is actually thinking in terms of very old-fashioned, the old, with deindustrialization happening in the first world, with China becoming the manufacturing workhorse of the world. Now the global north is suddenly thinking in terms of how to bring back those jobs through. So green is, as he correctly said, a backdoor entry for the old debate on bringing the jobs back. And I think it's not a bad thing. In fact, every country currently for this kind of, it's actually a paradigmatic shift that we are talking about. So industrial policy is very much required for every country, even if it comes at the cost of not having a global Green Deal. If each country does its own Green Deal, that would be good enough a start in terms of changing the energy mix. But why do I focus so much on industrial policies? Because if we don't do it, I mean, first is, of course, the global north is already doing it through these, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and so on and so forth, is that we would be falling into the same old trap of the colonial pattern of trade. We would be supplying primary commodities to them. They will have the technology. They will have the patents to these technologies, and we'll merely be primary commodity. I mean, the renewable resources, that is already happening. I mean, from Africa, the trade paper came up recently, which in fact Sovic co-authored, where they've shown that just as we had the raw materials moving from the global south to the global north earlier, which China broke the pattern of, we are moving increasingly as far as green energy is concerned in that direction. And that is a disaster because we've seen in terms of what happens to the terms of trade in such a situation, if the global north controls technology, then the prices that you get for your commodities, even if you have a comparative advantage in the commodities that you're producing, in the end you lose. So it is important to think slightly long term, even if it requires some fundamental changes there. So otherwise, you would actually be becoming a victim of what one could call carbon imperialism. We had imperialism of a different kind earlier, but this, and that is a serious problem for the global south. So in this context, if we place this Indian Green Deal, then in terms of finances, if I may quickly just say so, the point that we are making is in terms of the government expenditure that it does. Now, in fiscal policy, government spends. So this is an additional expenditure that they would be doing. And when it is, let's say, balanced budget, even then it creates, it's not a net, zero, because government spends, it taxes, but of the tax, you were not consuming all, right? So in that sense, there's only a partial fall in consumption or in investment that takes place, whereas government uses the entire money, what is called a balanced budget multiplier. So that is, at least, I mean, in terms of that economic thing, should not be a problem. But this federal policy about government finances getting affected is a very genuine concern that if you shift to carbon taxes, the fuel taxes would go away. Where would the revenue come from? And where would the expenditure happen? I could argue, I would say that the social security system that the government is financing, that itself could be carbon dividend. I mean, you don't need to separately create a carbon dividend. I mean, public health, for example, is financed by carbon tax, much better than then you actually link these policies to carbon taxes directly. So you're essentially using Surasan, for example, your PDS. It's financed by taxes currently, but call it carbon. I mean, not call it, you do a carbon tax and finance it. So the dividends are in the form of actually what we already have people receiving from the government, except that it is financed from the carbon tax per se. So, things can be worked out in that manner. But it still creates the problem in terms of state versus the center, because carbon tax would be one, whereas fuel taxes are state specific. Now, whether one can have a carbon tax which is state specific or not, I can't say offhand. If fuel taxes can be different, perhaps even carbon taxes could be, but I don't know. Because at the end of the day, carbon tax, at least for us, is the tax which is at source. So it is effectively a tax from the energy source where it is coming, where the oil port or at the port or wherever the oil is entering into your economy. In which case, it is effectively actually a tax on fuel of different kinds of fuel. So which percolates down. So on top of that, states can have their own taxes, additional taxes to finance their own schemes. Ideally, in an ideal world, it should be a federal system. You take taxes on behalf of the state, but you give it to the state the share that they deserve. That is how it should be. Then there would not be any conflict between the center and the state. But unfortunately, that is not the situation that we are in. Linked to the industrial policy is also the question of, most of the responses currently are to the last discussion, because that is what is noted down here. And, about the home market versus the foreign market. Again, I think this is a debate that we had during the post-colonial development phase. Every country was discussing this, whether we should have an import substituting industrialization or an export-oriented growth. Whichever one you choose to have, it also, of course, depends on in export-oriented thing. It depends on, as you said, the lead market. If you don't have a market, where would you send it to? So to begin with, you would have to create a domestic market for this, in my opinion, like every other country is doing. And in fact, that should be the excuse to create your own domestic market all the way as far as possible in the value chain. I'm not responding to all the questions. I responded partly to Karthik on this whole finance thing about the employment in reality and induced versus indirect jobs. So basically, the way NSS does not give you that, absolutely, because NSS gives you numbers for that sector in terms of employment in that particular sector. But what the IO helps you with is tells you that 1 unit of an output of a particular sector, how many units of other outputs are there in that. So effectively, from the IO, you are creating the indirect input of a commodity. And from there, using the NSS data, you're creating the indirect job. So that's essentially, which is not really incorrect because, yes, NSS doesn't give it, but at the end of the day, IO is providing you exactly that 1 unit of, let's say, this computer is coming from these many sectors, so you can calculate that skill. About the, so in that particular thing, if the sectors don't exist, and it happened obviously in our case, for example, when we were looking at numbers generated from weatherization. Now these industries don't exist in India. So what do you do? And those are, quick fixes that I think there are global numbers. I mean, there are certain numbers that if you were to create these jobs domestically, which are the sectors in which it would get created? And construction is one sector which comes up. I think since it is universally used, those numbers are what everybody uses in the IO. But yes, it would vary across countries. But at the end of the day, these are projections. Nothing is going to happen exactly in the way that anybody. I mean, none of the models can predict that. But by and large, let's say ballpark figure, that those countries which have these industries, if this is what they're doing in terms of 50% in construction, 10% here, 5% there, you use those same numbers here, which is what we have done to create a multiplier of the employment multiplier. Then by and large, one would say is, kind of keeping the world numbers and matching it to India. So that's the best you can do for non-existing sectors. Nuclear, my position on, but I will leave it at that. So Neetsuda, many big questions, not all of that I can respond to, but some that I would like to respond to about this whole free riding thing. I think it's too late in the day now to actually still be discussing that. I know, I mean, it's a real problem in economics, one of the most important problems in environment in particular. But if I can switch to Hindi for just a moment, in our side of the world, they do this pehle aap. Ye pehle aap mein, it will never end. Aap pehle shuru kijiye aur hum pehle shuru karen will be the end of this world. So it's important that all countries, if you show the intention that you are doing this, perhaps in terms of the negotiating table itself, you would have the upper advantage to some extent. And specifically, so if you were to negotiate collectively. Currently in COPs, India is negotiating for itself, China is negotiating for itself. There is never a collective effort. And if there is a collective effort, it is in the regressive direction, that we should do more coal, we should have more, instead of doing the opposite, that not only do you decarbonize, you also fund our decarbonization, because you are the ones who have the legacy of creating this problem in the first place. So I know, again, an ideal world may not happen, but the question is that is the same thing that happened with WTO as well. And we have won battles in WTO when we have fought collectively in many instances in trade negotiations. So that is the direction in which the climate negotiations would also have to take place, instead of us trying to find the space in terms of the right to burn. And that is the perspective from which, if we approach these negotiations, then I don't think it would in the end help us or the world in general. About India versus China, I just wanted to show one chart. It's alarming. We did not expect it to be like that, but it is. And if I can just take 1 second to show you that. Particularly India and China. Just 1 second, not this one. I'll show you this. not even this. Look at this. This is the emission from coal among the BRICS countries. We are not doing north versus south. Just look at where China is. And India, you may say that India is nowhere close to that. But if you push, let's say, if you look at China 4 decades ago and India today, it may very well be that India would be the next China. I mean, if the growth takes place at the rate at which it is taking, nobody would have said in 1980 China would be what it is in terms of emissions from coal, but it is. So why do we need to wait for those 4 decades before and just to realize that we are going to be what we are in? And China happens to be a key player. And as Ishwaran correctly said, we shouldn't consider it to be in the global south anymore in terms of emissions or otherwise. So it is important to see where India could go. And if it is going for us progressive people in this part of the world to stop them from moving in the direction that, let's say, the Chinese industrial policy led them to. They are doing course correction now. We have the opportunity of planning ahead and use this decade as, again, Ishwaran correctly said, to prepare and to think in terms of that transition. If we don't,
I just want to briefly interject here, primarily because I mean, don't want to sort of derail the thing, but in terms of this, looking at where India versus China is, in fact, models say that if a 2040 peaking with a 2070 net zero, India's consumption of the global carbon space will still be only 50% of China's. Now, in fact, even less than 50% of China's, because as you know, right, there is already action underway that is taking us on a downward trajectory. In the decade or in another decade and a half, we'll basically be getting down and we'll not be reaching anywhere near the level. So I think the point to be made there is definitely an element of the rest of the world needing to contribute to India on account of our continued historic low contribution, as well as going forward as well. We will not be anywhere close given our population size. I mean, I think absolutely as well, we'll not be even 50% of China, and we'll probably be even less than, and not probably, we are definitely lower than the US and the EU for a much larger population size. So I think this kind of distorts what actually India ends up doing in the 2070 timeframe, wherein India definitely does not see anything like this kind of growth. And I think the same arguments are being made, for instance, on cooling as well, right? Where they said, India's cooling demand is going to wreck the planet. But again, I think we need a little bit more of a sober debate where we say that, it's not indeed going to be that bad. So a small correction, but I think, the overall point I think you're making is not incorrect, that, we should not steer in that direction.
Yeah, I'm not saying that India would replicate China, but I'm saying that we are at a point that we can see the possibility in which it could go. If it doesn't go, nothing like it. But the fact that we are not necessarily planning, this is an academic debate. At the same time, we can promise the moon in 2070, but will we deliver it is a serious question in terms of if we don't have a plan. And with this government, I really don't have that much trust that the promises that they make are necessarily going to be delivered as well. Anyway, that is a matter of debate, perhaps. So yeah, I haven't responded frankly to all the points.
Rohit, what I was suggesting is that, the amount of coal that China is using today, India will never be able to manage that in future, anytime in future, because where will they come from? India's own coal will not be able to supply that much. From foreign countries also it will be difficult. So that is all the more reason that you have to choose a path which is different from China.
So even better. If there is a supply constraint, then per force we
exactly
have to.
Yes.
Yeah. No. I'm just saying that the fact that India is necessarily on a different plane and is going to be cleaner by design is something that may not happen, and definitely would not happen if we don't keep a track of where we are heading. So in terms of, that's why a planning, a policy framework which keeps that in mind is all I was referring. Not saying India is the next China. I'm not saying that.
Okay, so Rohit, do you have more responses? or you like to rest for a while?
No, I'm done with the responses. As I said, sorry, I haven't answered everything. But A, I don't have answers to. B, there is not enough time. So yeah.
So that's nice. So this discussion probably narrows down to one statement, that it's always good to decarbonize as you are growing, rather than wait for achieving full growth and then worry about decarbonization. We are a little above our scheduled time, but it's been a very interesting presentation and even more interesting debate and response to that. So I would like to give at least 2 to 3 minutes for any questions that are from participants who are online with us. Please raise your hands if you have any queries. I can see Professor Manoj Panda online with us, and if he has any interventions, it will be very nice. Any other participants are also welcome. I can see a lot of familiar names in case they have any queries. I do not see any hands raised. So, Rohit, in case you have no follow-ups, we can bring it to a close.
Sure.
Is that all right? So I would like to thank you for the presentation, and to all our 3 discussants for the day, for a very wonderful and engaging session. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.